Now we want to turn our focus to chapter 4 in our book, is tensions over judgment. How do we think that something is right or wrong? Or what is our gauge to say this should be judged as a correct action or an incorrect action? Well, in our culture, let's call it a Roman Western style culture, we put everything in a series and we say everything starts with A, and if it goes right, it will go B, C, D, all the way to the end and stop with a Z. We systematize everything we do. And we say if A is correct and B is correct and we keep going on, then the conclusion will be correct. In other words, we live in a very systemized way. Other cultures, most of our, what we would call our Eastern cultures, places like Asia and Africa, South America, the way of thought there is not in a defined system, it's more of a holistic or a universal way of thought. And they might say that A is correct and B is correct even though they don't have any correlation with each other. In America, we want to see things done a certain way from start to finish. They say it doesn't matter to us, this is right and that's right, even though they don't fit together naturally. For example, when you look at the Hebrews in the Old Testament, when God began to work with the Hebrews, He would reveal little pieces to them. Part to Abraham, a little part to Abraham's children, and then He would reveal stuff to Moses, and He would give a little bit more to Isaiah. And God revealed piece by piece His desires for the people all the way through the Old Testament. A couple thousand years of history, but it wasn't categorized. It was just stories that all stood alone on themselves, as well as, if you put them together, it made a whole story, but each story was unique in and amongst itself. We in the West aren't like that. And so God gave us the book of Romans and Paul the Apostle to give us a very systematic way to think. Now, we are more like those in Rome that want to understand the gospel from beginning to end and have all the arguments and all the answers and all of those questions pushed off and everything boxed up and packaged correctly. Other cultures, they really don't care about how it fits. They just want to know, is it right or wrong? Is it true or is it false? And so when we go into these other cultures, we want to say, this is black or white. This is totally wrong or totally right. And they say, well, it might have some wrong, it might have some right, and they have a hard time coming to a conclusion. But we come to a conclusion almost instantly. We need to be very careful. Now, because we have a standard, the Bible, we must conclude at the end of a conversation, at the end of an action, at the end of an entire trip, what I did it please God? Did it honor God? And did it show love to the people? Was I successful or was I a failure? Now, in these situations, we need to come back to what we talked about in our introduction. We have God's culture, and let's simplify that by calling it the 10 Commandments. You shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not commit adultery, and so on. You know the 10 Commandments. And then we have our home culture, our mother's culture, that adds a million other things onto it. And so when we go into a situation, if we are culturally blind to what they consider to be a gray area, or right or wrong, we will offend them culturally by misjudging the situation. Let me give you an example. American missionary that I met with, he came into my country. He was invited into a very important man's home. The man was an equivalent, a senator in his country. He's called a member of parliament. Well, this member of parliament invited this man into his home and said, "Sir, come to my house and meet my family, and we'll spend time talking about what you want to do here in this country." So as this American missionary enters this very influential African man's home, the daughter of the African man got down on her knees and reached up and began to shake the American's hand. Well, the American misunderstood this action totally. He did not know that to go down on your knees when a visitor comes over is seen as a sign of respect. It's not belittling to the girl. It's not, some kind of male chauvinism. It's simply a form of respect in that culture. as this young girl is reaching up to shake this American visitor's hand, the American visitor looks at this girl and says, I won't allow you to do that because my mother would be offended if you did that. And the American took this girl by the hand and made her stand on her feet. Now, in the American's mind, he thought that he judged the situation correctly. He thought he was honoring the woman by causing her to stand up and look at him eye to eye and be equal. But actually, in that culture, what actually happened is she was embarrassed. She was doing what she was taught by her grandmother and her mother and her family, and nobody else in the room had any problem with this young girl on her knees greeting this man. And as the American lifted her up, that young girl was embarrassed. She was, in a sense, put into a place of shame because now she was dishonoring the guest. So here's what we have to realize. When we don't understand their culture and we are culturally blind, we will misjudge circumstances and we will do things that will deeply offend. At the same time, they will do things to us that will offend us. But you know what? If it doesn't break the Ten Commandments, don't worry about it. If it's a girl bowing down to shake your hand or any other example, don't worry about it. Go with it because you're in their culture. If they came to America, well, yes, then they would change and become like us because we would be the majority and they would be the minority. But when you go into their world, don't bring American concepts as the ruling, culture of the world. America is just one way. If it doesn't break the Ten Commandments, let it go. One of the things that bothers me the most about being overseas when I was living in Asia is my Asian friends in Sri Lanka, or let's say India, they ate rice and curry for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And they do not use forks and knives. They don't even use chopsticks. Like when I was in Hong Kong, I appreciated having chopsticks. In the part of Asia I lived in, they give you a plate of rice and they pour this curry sauce all over the top of it, and then you dip in with your fingers, and as the curry drips off your fingers, you got to shove it in your mouth. Well, if you don't know how to do it right, it goes down your chin. It's the most obnoxious, annoying thing I could ever do. But that's where ministry starts, isn't it? In the home, eating the food. What if I was to say to my Sri Lankan friends, I won't eat at your house unless you give me a fork and a knife? That's not what we do. We go there and we say, you know what, the Ten Commandments says nothing about eating rice and curry. Now my mother, if she saw me, from halfway across the room, she'd slap me upside the head and say, son, I taught you to eat with a fork. But the Sri Lankans don't have a problem with it. And as I become like them, no matter how irritating it is to me, it's no big deal. Let it go. If it doesn't break the Ten Commandments, it's just a cultural issue. Remember, Paul said, I became all things to all men that I might save some. Now, when you read that clearly in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul says, I never sin against God, but I changed to be a Gentile with the Gentile, and I changed to be a Jew with a Jew. If I am willing to serve them, even though it's uncomfortable to the deepest part of me, then I can have a chance to be a successful missionary. Spend time. Be with them. Do what they do. Do not misjudge a circumstance. Learn and remove the cultural blinders so that you might understand what is seen as important and not important in their culture. If it doesn't offend God, go with it no matter how uncomfortable it is.